name is Andrew Smith. I'm a professor of civil engineering and engineering mechanics here at Columbia, and I also direct the Center for Smart Streetscapes, or we call it CS3 for short, and we're an NSF-funded engineering research center. And we're hosting this, I guess, satellite event here at the AI Summit Festival at Columbia. So the center, the CS3, we're a partnership between 5 universities. So Columbia is the lead, but we have Rutgers as a partner, Lehman College, Florida Atlantic University, and also the University of Central Florida. And we're 2.5 years into a 10-year NSF funding period. So if you think back to 2.5 years ago, that means we were founded, or we were launched in September of 2022, and ChatGPT came out in November of 22. So right after we began, we began with a research program, and really what we're here to talk about today is artificial intelligence, and obviously that has had an impact, a big impact on our research agenda, projects. We had to pivot, and obviously that is pervasive throughout our entire research program. So as I said, we're here to talk about artificial intelligence in the urban context. As humans, obviously, we've used our human senses and our human intelligence to navigate and understand cities forever. Some of those observations, obviously, we can log, but other things are, I would say, as ephemeral as our memories, right? They're just forgotten over time. But in modern smart cities, we have all kinds of different public space sensing technologies, IoT, and ways in which to log those, record them. All of those things are at our disposal. And then when you take that together with rapid development of artificial intelligence, that can become an exciting component in how we manage and understand our urban systems. And obviously the data upon which the AI models are built is often public space collected data. So and that obviously has the potential to reveal personally identifiable information. And so there's a privacy and ethics aspect to how we think about the collection of that public space data in the context of then its ultimate use, and hopefully the benefit that applications that are developed on top of that can bestow. So here at the center, we're working to explore opportunities to make our urban environments safer and more livable through the use of fast wireless and optical communications, new sensing modalities, but also AI-driven situational awareness, simulation, and optimized control, and very importantly, to understand those privacy functionality trade-offs as we develop our technologies. More data can generally improve performance and our understanding, but sometimes it can also make privacy leakage an issue, and that can lead to mistrust of technologies. So sustainable and acceptance of trust of technologies is very important to us. So we want to explore, and that's what really this panel is about, ethical and policy frameworks, but also technical frameworks that are suited to different types of applications. So there can be urban analytics, which I would often think of as often offline or aggregated data applications, but also real-time, highly personalized and interactive applications that we're exploring. And the collection, the modeling requirements for these applications is really quite different. So for example, our center, just to give you some examples, we have a research project that enables blind and low vision pedestrians with wayfinding on the street. So that allows very precise guidance and collision avoidance. And that is an example, I would say, or an application that serves an individual. It has to function in real time, but also depends on the acquisition of data about all users in the streetscape, unbeknownst to them. Other applications could be looking at smart intersections, e-bike enforcement, or other kind of, let's say, public safety driven anomalous activity detection kinds of applications. And others are pretty benign, I think, but from a privacy perspective, for example, monitoring air quality using a variety of novel sensor modalities. So I'm delighted to say that we've brought together an outstanding panel of experts who bring, by design, very diverse expertise to the table. So we have from policy for technology, for legal and governance standards, particularly around policing and law enforcement, privacy technology aspects, but also the development of AI-driven applications. So I'm just going to introduce our moderator. So Professor Henning Schulzrinne from the center. He's also a professor of computer science and also electrical engineering. He has a vast experience in computer communications networks, protocols, but also policy and economics around computer networks. And he will moderate the session. I'll turn it over to you. Thank you, Henning.
Thank you. So welcome everyone to this panel. We won't be able to do justice to the topic as outlined, but we will try to organize ourselves a little bit. One of the hard parts, as Andrew alluded to, is that AI safety related topics span such a broad range of concerns, particularly in an urban setting, that often when we make these statements, oh yeah, it should be trustworthy, those statements are true, but not terribly helpful in both designing technology as well as understanding the actual trust issues and governance issues that arise. So what we'll be trying to do here is we'll start, Jesse Rule will give a bit of a background presentation based on summary on that. But what we'll be trying to do is roughly divide our time here into three components. We'll be trying to set the stage to indicate as to what are the different modularities that we have, modalities of data generation, and then also next identify some of the privacy and other ethical concerns. It's not just privacy, however understood. And then, given that we all have some engineering background here, maybe at least on the panel, that we'll be looking at what might be approaches, both technical and non-technical solutions, because I think we all realize that simply developing new algorithms, new software, new systems is important, but likely insufficient to address the problems that we have. To start by setting the stage a bit, one of the difficulties that we have that is maybe a little different than what we say and have in a medical context, where also you generate lots of data, or even in a web context, is that we have quite a bit of variety of sensors in that urban smart city type of environment. Said all the way from sensors that cannot conceivably capture anything except what they're designed to do, namely, say, air quality or noise type of ones, if you notice measurement. But then others which, at least, and the noise measurement is a good example, where you would have a sensor that probably uses a generic component, a microphone, but you can't really tell whether it gathers only how noisy the buses and other street participants are, as in it returns a decibel reading without the ability to identify anybody, or whether that same microphone also records incidental conversations or other more privacy-sensitive facets of urban life. So we have then on the application side also a division, as said, where some urban applications are of a very aggregate nature. The data that we collect is, let's say, vehicle counts after implementing congestion pricing. Once the data at least is made available, it is pretty clear that we cannot use the data, and it's observable by anybody that the data, even with external data sources, can be de-anonymized, or that you can do anything except maybe determine as to how many people paid the toll that particular hour and what may have changed between that. But many of the other sensors, just like my hypothetical sound sensors, have multiple applications, from real-time control, like the blind navigation one mentioned, to helping with autonomous vehicles or semi-autonomous vehicles to navigate the complex streetscape, to help with localization, for example, locating where the vehicle happens to be, and just more statistical applications, all the way to applications that are not just used, for example, for traffic enforcement, say blocking bus lanes, to actual criminal enforcement, and which may actually then often reach back in time. It may not just be something that happens right now, but it may be data that was captured a month ago, a year ago, possibly for a very different purpose, such as simply observing congestion. So the urban landscape, unlike many other environments, is characterized by multi-use of sensors that is both a strength and a potential weakness. In terms of trust, because often you can't just say, yep, there's a sensor here, it does something, I know how sensitive that data is, maybe I need to know whether that's combined with an identity, say in a medical setting, or not, but it's relatively clear when I have a blood pressure measuring device or an EKG, what this thing can do, and it's not suddenly going to do something else. Cameras, microphones, other sensors that are built into vehicles, for example, often I don't know that they exist. I don't know exactly what they do. I don't know who has the data, and I don't know how long the data sticks around in particular. So that, I think, raises a particular set of both hard technical and hard trust challenges, since it's not just a data set I can look at in many cases, because the same sensor may generate many different data sets in that. So let's start. Jesse, if you want to give your perspective a little bit, introduce yourself. In each case, please briefly introduce yourself, so that people know literally where you're coming from, and then tell us a little bit about your perspective.
Sure. Hi. My name is Jesse Wu. I am going to talk about a governance solution to mass data collection and surveillance. And spoiler alert, that governance solution is going to be something called a data trust. And so I'm going to walk through what the problems are and what governance even is, which is hard to define, and then what we're doing at NYU with data trusts. And so I am a technologist and AI policy counsel at the Policing Project at the NYU Law School. The Policing Project is a think tank. They work on civil rights, criminal justice reform, and police accountability. And so I work on those issues with respect to technology and use of AI. So really, right, we're here because of data, right? And we leave data traces everywhere we go, both online in the virtual world and in meat space, right? We leave location traces through our phone and tracking through apps. You know, maybe you use a Tesla, you know, whatever, what do they call it? Self-driving, whatever, that is not actually self-driving, right? But I think most important to this discussion is we have embedded sensors in public spaces, spaces that used to be ephemeral, but are now capturing more and more information about us. And in addition, we have things like license plate readers that can track your car, so not just at one point in one intersection, but they can now be aggregating that data and getting your location over time. And so the aggregation is really the name of the game, right? Because it's not just the individual streams of data, but there's a whole industry that is built around gathering all these data streams, combining them, packaging them, and then selling them for commercial customers and also to law enforcement customers. In addition, police vendors have really moved toward what you might call a platform model. So there's a company called Flock that will set up for your local police department something called a real-time crime center, where the license plate reader data, the body-worn camera data, the social network analysis all gets streamed to one place. It's all analyzed and presented there. And the largest police vendor in the country is called Axon. They're formerly Taser. They they promote something called evidence.com, which is their kind of one-stop shop for all of their police technology. Right? So all of their body-worn camera footage gets streamed into evidence.com. But what does this have to do with AI? As Andrew mentioned, first of all, these large data stores are used to train models. And to make this more concrete, Mayor Adams actually recently proposed to train predictive policing algorithms on a centralized store of municipal data. And maybe we'll talk about issues there, but that caused a lot of controversy. But even more, machine learning is used to extract insights from data, right? That's why we all use machine learning. So, for example, now you can use facial recognition to search an entire DMV database for a match from a photo that was drawn from a surveillance camera from the scene of a crime, right? Whereas before, an individual couldn't feasibly go through and match every face to this camera. There is a company called Ubiquity that sells connected devices and security cameras. One new feature that they're promoting is a kind of language model-based search. So you could search for the guy with the green shirt if you think he did something wrong. And okay, that's great. But they have not placed any sort of filters on the kinds of searches you can do. So there was a recent report that said you can actually also search for person who should be deported or sexy woman. And I tend to think that's not so great. And then there's just a lot of other things. There's social network analysis to find known associates and how are these things working? It's all based on this data, right? And privacy law, at least privacy law in the United States, has really not kept up with this problem. There is no comprehensive federal consumer privacy law that would rein in the data broker industry. And there's a patchwork of laws around the country. Some are stronger than others. They do different things. But there's really, the industry still continues to thrive. And in addition, we, at least in the policing context, and this is like a little different from what my co-panelists work on, but in the policing context, we think of the kind of first line safeguard as being the Constitution and the Fourth Amendment, which protects against unlawful searches and seizures. Usually you have to get a warrant or something like this. But there's this blindness to the difference between collection and querying, because courts will generally say once law enforcement or someone selling to law enforcement has collected the data, and as long as they did that lawfully, then law enforcement can query that data as much as they want. They can kind of do anything they want with it, even though it's really the query that is giving them the important information. And so the Policing Project's faculty director has ongoing work that we're all kind of involved in to say, actually, well, we think constitutionally there should be a requirement that you need some sort of predicate, not only to collect, but to query the data. Right? Maybe you need a warrant, maybe you need something else, and this should be described in law and regulated. But okay, so there's a big problem, too much data, not enough regulation. So what can you do? I think there are, broadly speaking, three solutions. One, there's a legal solution. You can pass new laws. You can do impact litigation to try and change what you think the Constitution, how it's interpreted. My organization does both of those things. There are technical solutions, right? There's differential privacy. You can place actual constraints on how people can query the data. You can use federated learning or do more of this sensing and processing without ever collecting it. And in fact, Roxana, I think, is going to talk about some really interesting work around kind of defining different levels of APIs with respect to the privacy leakage. But then there's this other thing that we call governance. And what is governance? I think of governance as it's the rules around how data is handled on the ground, both technically and administratively, to protect certain values in that use. Right? So it's not just a free-for-all. You have rules. And one form of governance is something called a data trust. And A data trust is a legal structure that provides independent stewardship of data for the benefit of groups or organizations, groups of organizations or people. And so it's kind of a database with extra steps, but the extra steps are very important. You know, for one thing, you need to have this thing called a trust. It needs to be a corporation or a nonprofit, or at the very least, a very strong nexus of contracts and rules that are governing it. You need to have both technical and administrative access controls, right? Like you can't just open it up to everyone. And you need restrictions on things like sharing and on use. So for example, you could require a predicate, like a warrant, before querying or accessing the data. So it's a way to use data for certain things that we deem beneficial or to the benefit of certain people, like the public, while shielding it from other things that we think are not so good, like querying for people we think should be deported. So to get more specific, the policing project is working on building a data trust of body-worn camera data. And we think body-worn camera data is a good candidate for this for a few reasons. One, there's a lot of it. There's been a big proliferation of these cameras in police departments across the country. One estimate I read is over 100 petabytes and growing. And the data is very sensitive, both for the officer who wears the camera and for the people who appear in it. You know, if there's an officer involved shooting, or, you know, police appear in people's lives often in very difficult times, you know, you want to make sure you're respecting the subjects of that data. And it's also very hard to access for a variety of reasons, but it tends to be warehoused in places like evidence.com and only really released in rare occasions. So Policing Project is partnering with researchers at Stanford who focus, and the focus of their research is on police practices. Understanding, for example, what is the impact of training on respectful interactions with the public? You know, does this improve outcomes? You know, how do police, once they've had this training, interact with people of color compared to before? And they've worked with this in Oakland and San Francisco, but just that process of getting access to that data was very painstaking. It took years. And so ideally, if we could aggregate this data and get it from police departments across the country, not only is there now more data they can look at, but you can start to do comparative work, right? You can say you can get natural experiments from that. But at the same time, you have to make sure you're being protective of that data. So we're looking into automated sort of blurring and redaction, and also just privacy protections that are written into the rules of how people use it. We're thinking about things like, you know, can you have a sort of IRB type of model or an ethics board? In addition, we're convening an advisory board that consists of stakeholders from law enforcement, research, engineers, but also privacy advocates and community advocates to make sure we're getting the right rules. And we hope this serves as a kind of model for data trusts going forward. So just very quickly, two takeaways are, one, you need a combination of technical and policy measures to have effective governance, which means that there is absolutely a place for engineers and technologists in this work. And the other is that, you know, ideas for data governance go way beyond policing, and that's something I'm really excited to hear about. You know, like one issue that actually when I was in Roxana's class we talked about was, you know, there was a lot of excitement about using ride-sharing data by urban planners and to understand how people are moving about the city, but at the same time, very serious concerns about re-identification and what happens if you just release the data publicly. And so, you know, maybe a data trust is one model to help with that, and maybe, you know, there's probably many others. So that's what I have to say, and I'm really looking forward to this conversation.
Thank you. So I wanted to do one quick follow-up just for people who may not be as versed in Fourth Amendment law. So, for example, you mentioned license plate cameras or traffic cameras as well. You're saying that once they have subscribed to Flock, they can then go, if they found a bank robber, they can find out as to which license plate, where that license plate has been, and maybe who the associates might have been about. Is that kind of what you're saying? They don't need a warrant for that.
Yeah, that's generally right. So there's some nuance here in terms of the Supreme Court has said at some point, if you track people as they move, so generally if you see someone moving in public, and I'm a cop, I don't need a warrant to say like, oh, they're right there in public. That's not secret. But if you're tracking them over a long enough period of time with certain kinds of technologies, at some point the Supreme Court has said, well, this is actually a search and we're going to require a warrant. So it's just a very fine line drawing exercise, but in general, yes, using a license plate reader to see, for example, who's going in and out of this corner right in front of the bank right before it was robbed, would probably be fine and not require additional process.
Yep. Okay. So I wanted to, kind of along with themes that I set out earlier, is start one round, in addition to you, particularly those who have not had a chance to speak up yet, to talk about what are the specific concerns that the combination of urban data and AI raises. I think you made a point that the data has existed, if I paraphrase you, but AI has made it possible now to do things that were just humanly difficult to do with humans, simply because sifting through hours of traffic camera data, looking for that person that looks kind of like the person that you're looking for police context, say, was just prohibitive in almost all circumstances. So that seems like a good example where it's not the data, it's the AI that actually raises potential concerns of ethics and privacy and Fourth Amendment protections. Either of you wanted to comment on where the combination of data that may well have existed as a data type beforehand and AI raises particular concerns. Oh. Go ahead.
I can take yeah, I think you raise a good point, which is, and I'm just going to echo that for one, aggregated data that's the fuel of AI algorithms, but also the capabilities that emerge of being able to, you can be much more efficient about finding that like very detailed piece of information that you're looking for. I think everyone knows from their use of LLMs now that, something else emerges, which is the whole notion of hallucinations, and the fact that, a lot of these generative models in particular are fundamentally stochastic. And so that brings up another question about whether using it for good or bad, is it even telling you the truth, right? And so how are you grounding the responses you're getting from these AIs, which are mediating access to the raw data, in what's really observed and what's really the truth? What is revealed? Is what the model answering something that it hallucinated but seems plausible, or is there really an example in the data that supports what the model is suggesting? And it's hard to keep up with, right? Because there's more and more data being produced by more and more of these sensors, which is why why we want to deploy the AIs, because fundamentally we want to make sense of this data as quickly as possible. But we have to be very careful, again, about privacy concerns, about what the law says is sort of a reasonable thing to do, about ethical concerns, and I think that has to be included in any sort of broader conversation and deployment of these technologies, particularly in urban spaces where the information you can extract from sensing modalities is essentially multiplexed, right? There's lots of different types of data, people's data, you leave your digital footprints everywhere, and it's very difficult to control if unless you put the right mechanisms in place.
Okay. Roxana, you want to add to that?
I don't know if this works. Okay, this works now? Okay. So I agree with what's been said so far. I'm just going to point out something pretty obvious, which is that, AI is a giant driver to data collection, because with AI, more data means better. And so, we've had data collection and a lot of it for many years, but I think now it's, going enormously up, right? And that I think, when you allow enormous data collection, I am not, I don't know what it is that you can do in order to stop, and protect privacy, right? It's extremely difficult unless you're very careful about what you collect. So, unless you're in a situation where you can control what you collect, minimize that, and so on, there is very, very, very limited things that you can do, to ensure privacy when there is enormous aggressive data collection. So that to me. Now, with respect to AI, now with respect to smart cities, I think privacy has been actually a bane of large scale deployments. And I don't know exactly why and so on, but it occurs to me that, yeah, this has been tracking me for quite some time now, but if I decide that I want to leave it at home, I can leave it at home and it's not going to track me, right? If I decide that, I don't want to be tracked with that, I forget what it's called, the thing that you put in the car to go through tolls. I don't drive, so I don't know. Easy Pass, thank you. Yes, those things. Then maybe I can wrap that up. I'm not so sure what I do. I don't drive, so I don't have a license plate issue. Things like this. But the problem is with smart cities, continuous collection happens, right? Or can happen. The hope is that we can make it not so, but we'll see. But the concern is that it happens without any way of us, having any say in it, right? Or taking, except for going into the woods and, staying there is nothing you can do to avoid collection. And that I think creates that plus the big draw to data collection that AI creates a very, very scary endeavor that I think is what is causing smart city efforts in Europe. The Amsterdam recent case, I don't know who's seen, right? Kind of fail, at least in terms of kind of large-scale deployments and ambitious deployments and really realizing the dream.
And I think you just made a point of that data becomes more valuable, not just for training purposes, but also suddenly that data that just wasn't very valuable, because you can now analyze it. So I'm just imagining as a probably, I hope, I'm not giving anybody any business ideas here, but come on, like the old where you had a private eye checking out a possibly, let's say, a spouse that was having an affair. Now, you had to hire somebody to track that spouse. Now, if you can gather enough street camera data that is public, I mean, DOT puts out a lot of street camera data that nobody cared about, I mean, unless you truly...
From the couch.
Yeah, I mean, unless you wanted to check out how congested the West Side Highway was or the bridge was to plan your morning commute. But now suddenly it becomes something where a divorce attorney could say, oh yeah, this is actually useful. I don't have to hire a private eye, or I can supplement that to find out if my client has been cheated on or not, or whatever. So do you see particularly, I think you talked about data brokers in particular, that we don't just have the classical model of privacy that we see as towards people we know that we may not necessarily want to have a full picture of what all we do, and kind of the government broadly speaking. But whether the other actors, you mentioned data brokers, but they have particular business models. What do you see as in an urban data sense environment, do you see particular concerns there that we now have to worry about behavioral or other captured. And anybody else can obviously chime in too.
Yeah, I mean, so my first thought is always towards law enforcement, but even, city governments are involved with so many aspects of people's lives. I mean, it's part of the pushback against this notion of a kind of centralized data repository for the city of New York. Or I mean, there were people who were in favor of it and people who pushed back against it. But is that there are consequences that go beyond just like putting someone in jail, right? Like the city hands out benefits to folks, right? And if those benefits are imperiled for whatever reason, that can really impact people. Like the city is responsible for people's housing, and people's access to food and like don't they do? I think they fund some sort of like daycare, sort of like preschool benefits, right? So all these things that are like very impactful in people's lives, and used to be cabined behind the Department of Housing or the Department of whatever. As those get collected and more insights kind of percolate up from that, part of we just sort of we don't know. We don't like that's sort of the fun thing about AI and data is like you don't know what's going to come out of it. In that it can give you really interesting insights, but you can join data sets in weird ways that reveal things that you wouldn't want revealed. So it's really hard to predict.
Right. And one of the things that I think you alluded to is that we now have, beyond it used to be just largely criminal law enforcement for kind of warrant type of thing, and then more commercial, primarily advertising driven. But you alluded to, and I wanted to just tease that out a little bit more, because you could now use urban street data to just find out who didn't put their garbage in a bin as opposed to in a plastic bag, which you could not reasonably, I mean, unless you stationed somebody right at that intersection, or I mean, at that street, you wouldn't know who violated the garbage laws. I'm picking this somewhat as a relatively low impact, but important where you could see the trade-off. So I'm curious, and this is more broadly speaking, for your perspective, we've been talking like the privacy side as kind of a thing we all want to conserve, but you started alluding to kind of the other side, and you mentioned a little bit that some of these privacy efforts have not been moving ahead that much, give facial recognition technology bans and so on in that. So what do you see as kind of the argument that tends to make it difficult to institute strong laws once city governments and police and all that get involved? Whereas is it just we don't want to be encumbered, or is it something more than that?
Oh gosh, I mean, first of all, there's actually in some cases more action happening at the local and state level than certainly at the federal level. There's lots of like political economy reasons why that's in deadlock. But I think the biggest reason is just that we've allowed the technology to advance to the point where there are now vested interests that oppose regulation, and the harms are very abstract, and so it's hard to make a case that like, well, what does it matter if like Facebook is following me through when I use Facebook, even though it's actually like much more than that, right? So, and also people don't have a good concept of how they're being impacted by this in a lot of ways.
Anybody else want to comment on that? Yeah.
I don't have an input on the legal
Right.
part of the question, but in terms of move, so what I do understand, web and technology, and I do, as of a year and a bit ago, since I started working on kind of improving advertising and the privacy of online advertising, I understand a little bit that space now as well. And so I think the roadblock, in my view, there is a lot, what you said, yes, I'm sure, but from a technological perspective, the way I view this is that advertising, if we pick on advertising, which by the way, advertising is what funds the web. I'm just gonna say this, I think advertising, it's a prediction, I may be completely wrong, but if I were to guess, advertising will play a role, whether we like it or not, in smart cities, if, these things happen. Because as much as we would love those assistive technologies applications and all these, common good applications, I am not sure that they sell, okay? That they self-fund, okay? So what I do worry about kind of advertising becoming, the way to fund smart cities too. And then we have to ask, okay, so how do we do that? Are we okay with that? How do we do that, in a privacy-preserving way and so on? To return to web advertising, the roadblock there that I've been seeing is basically bad APIs, or inexistent, I would say, APIs. Okay, so technical roadblock, not legal roadblock. Probably there is one, kind of also roadblocks related to we don't want to move, we like it this way, and so on. You probably know that, for advertising purposes online, all of our moves online are being tracked. Okay. Why are they tracking this? They're tracking this because fundamentally they need to run a certain type of measurement or optimization that is cross-domain, okay? You see an ad here, you go and purchase somewhere else. What they want to measure is how many people who saw the ad went on and purchased. This is a fundamentally cross-domain function that they want to compute. There is no, if you know browsers, web protocols, you know that there is just, like the main API is governed by single origin, same origin policy. That is the same, the data within an origin can talk to that origin and that's it. Okay, that domain and that's it. Which means there is no API in browsers right now that can actually support advertising, which is cross-domain, okay? The lack of APIs, the lack of the ability to measure what you want in a way, that makes some sense, leads to hacks. These are apparently legal hacks for reasons that I can't understand, whatever, like that side I don't understand, right? But those are apparently legal and they're very hard to, shut down and so on. Hacks like, fingerprinting people, tracking people with third-party cookies and so on. Okay, but technically, if you're thinking of it, what would be the technical solution? The technical solution would be to just say, okay, so if we want to support that workload, because I don't know, it's funding the web, I guess, if, keeping it free by and large. If we, I'm not saying that we should, I block ads to be clear, okay? But the point is, if we want to support that, then the right thing to do is to open up APIs, proper APIs that allow, within the browser, that allow actual, these measurements that they need to be done, but in a good way, like, in a way that actually preserves privacy and so on, right? The hope is that if you open those kinds of APIs and they work well, then I don't know, maybe the changes can happen so that they don't do the hacking as well, right, in addition to the APIs. But basically, that's another kind of reason sometimes that, like a technical, limitation, right, particularly an API type of limitation, causes a really, really bad reaction and something that's really bad for us in the end, right? Which is, it causes hacking and we do not stand to win. I must say that on the browser side, we're moving along, and there is at least, under standardization process, there are some APIs that, that I participated on as well, with the privacy architecture for them that are, hopefully they will be, they're under W3C standardization right now, and hopefully they'll be adopted, and then hopefully we'll move away, and these companies will be weaned off of, the aggressive tracking that's going on. But of course, this is a hypothesis. Something like this could be, applied potentially in smart cities, right? Yeah. Properly defined APIs can do a lot. And, improperly, the opposite is improperly defined APIs will lead to basically, a completely untenable situation in smart cities too. That is kind of my opinion. So I don't know, I'm a technologist, so I think, I'm a systems person, privacy architect, so I think in terms of APIs is how I think. APIs would restrict data access, basically. Yes.
So since we're moving into a solution discussion, I wanted to go to you to talk a little bit about, so we heard, I think now, one or two solutions already, namely one is kind of a trusted independent party, your data repository type of model. Census, for example, has had data enclaves for many, many years that are somewhat similar to that. For sensitive data that you would like to do analysis on in that. Roxana just talked about more, if I'm rephrasing it correctly, having APIs that provide socially desirable functionality, say you use the ad tracking example, but don't put this choice where you either get everything, track everybody everywhere in this example, or you get nothing, which also tends to be unstable because that incentivizes police department and advertisers to do workarounds, like property tracking on web browsers when people disable third-party cookies. So I'm curious if we can identify, if you want to start, other approaches, not just technical approaches, that might be part of a toolkit that can help us deal with, particularly with urban type of data, maybe more generally.
I would say one of the things I wanted to mention, and it's in relation to this. It's that from a technical perspective, all the value and promise is in aggregation, and all the APIs and systems support aggregation. Why do they do that? Because it's the easy thing to do. It's you turn a sensor on and you send the data somewhere and you store it. There's not more mechanism to that. You just store it.
Right.
And so it's sort of, for a long time, that's been the cheap and easy thing to do, and so that's the thing you're going to do first. That's also where all the danger lies. And so this is where the APIs constrain how you collect and for how long and across what spatial and temporal boundaries. And so once you have these APIs as constraints, now that limits the class of AI applications, machine learning techniques that you can actually apply. Because if you try to apply the one that were limitless, of course, that wouldn't work if you're fundamentally constraining the problem. But then there's a third one, which is the cost of getting it wrong. When you actually deploy on the street, and you don't interact with the community, it could get completely shut down. And we've seen that already in many of smart cities, attempts at smart cities, until recently even. And so that, at least in the center, has been a major part of the activities that we partake in. We talk to community members, we educate them, they educate us, and it's a back and forth so that they're comfortable with what we're doing, and it's clear to us that what we're doing is actually achieving a common goal, which is very sort of an ill-defined general notion of quality of life. Okay, so like the intention is there, all the interested parties are there, government, commercial, and the community. And then from there, again, that conversation plus APIs constraining what we can do starts to set clear boundaries around the class of applications that we can actually work on, and what we can do, right? Like what can we actually build, and which ones of those are actually useful. And so there's always that tension of, you don't want to pre-constrain, but I think in an urban setting, in particular, that is a fundamental part of the design process. That the constraints have to be there up front, as opposed to having a free-for-all. Because of even if you didn't care about the community, knowing that the cost is your thing's going to get shut down is an incentive to know that it's all incentive based, right? And so like, even if your heart's not there, you set up the incentives in such a way that everyone sort of gains something from it, and everyone has something to lose if it's not done together, right? And so, yeah, that's a big part of it.
We have, I think, roughly 10 minutes left, so I wanted to make sure that since this is normally built as a workshop, that we have an opportunity for the audience as well to ask questions or chime in as well, and then we'll see where we land with that. And I mean, I don't know if you want to do the microphone. Yeah.
Thank you, Roxana. So my first question is,
press the button. I can just shout.
okay, is that better?
That's, there sounds to be something's coming. Yeah.
Thank you for your time. So my question is, first one is, you guys talk about, you know, the tech workarounds and also the policy workarounds, but what about economic policies that might, like economic modeling that might incentivize the market to go in a more privacy conscious direction? Because, I mean, it sounds like, you know, it is, you know, the main reason that companies don't want to do that because it's not as profitable. So, are you guys, I don't know, brainstorm about maybe new models that will make it more profitable for, you know, the consumer market and companies to, you know, pay price for the truth, because they only do it in California and EU because, you know, they're forced to, but they don't like it.
Yeah, so
Yeah.
that's fine. I'll just, oh, she's great.
So the way I'm not an economist at all, but
Yeah.
yeah. But the way I think about sort of like the economic incentives is that they, you know, they don't arise from nowhere. They have to be driven by, you know, constraints on the technology or constraints placed by law. Like, as you say, there are some new models maybe emerging in Europe and California, and that is because they have different and stronger laws.
Yeah.
So, like, what I don't think is realistic is, like, you know, someone is going to put out the like privacy blockchain and like that's going to fix everything. You know.
Okay.
The microphone?
Oh.
As a follow-up, what do you guys think about the laws in California and the EU? Is it, I don't know, satisfactory? Are they?
I have a lot of opinions about the laws in California EU. I think they do some good things, and you know, I think it'll be interesting to see how the EU AI Act kind of shakes out. For no other reason that they're the first mover, and we kind of want to see what happens. But I think that they are thoughtful. I think they're like trying to get at the right thing, and we'll see how they end up.
So I'm no legal expert, you know, but I've worked on privacy for quite some time. I love the cookie pop-ups. They're very annoying. I love them because they're annoying. And so, you know, I think those were GDPR driven. And I think they caused basically, you know, sufficient pain for, you know, in terms of lack of, you know, less engagement and so on with the site, more annoyance on the users, that they've caused, at least, we'll see. Hopefully, they will cause even more, you know, annoyance, so, you know, so that third-party cookies can actually be, you know, retired. And they are now retired in 2 browsers, not the third one, the big one. Okay. But it was, I think, you know, I don't know, I'm speculating, but I think that has you know, had to play a role.
Okay. I want to make sure we get a few more questions in or comments in if somebody would like to. Anybody else?
Can I ask a
Go ahead.
question? Thank you very much for this panel. So a lot of what our center does often, or we think a lot about, you know, there's kind of cloud and edge, and there can be training, learning, modeling on aggregated data, but then there will be other data, which is, you know, it's very transient in its collection and storage. Probably the intention is that it be, you know, applied to something in real time, and so the inference then can be done at the edge. So in, you know, across policy, data governance, and also the technical part, I'm wondering how you think of that sort of modality of cloud and edge for for I think a lot of smart cities applications that we're considering.
Yes. No. I mean, I think the way you describe it is right. We want to collect a lot of data, and we want. I mean, the paradigm now with many of the more interesting models based on deep learning is certainly to collect a lot of data, label it, and train a model. And there aren't many solutions that don't require lots of data for these models to converge. I mean, that's just a fact, right? Like LLMs and everything else, multimodal LLMs, anything that's extracting, any kind of sort of interesting from a research perspective, model requires a lot of data. Inference certainly occurs at the edge, but one of the things that's emerging in conversation with Roxana is, the APIs and the constraints. So like, okay, you can train it on data offline, but what are we going to do with the data that we collect at the edge, and how long does it live for, and what's the scope of it? And so, although your application is very powerful, its power is going to be limited to some spatial temporal bounds, right? You can only run inference if your model can do something meaningful on 10 seconds of data. You can train it all you want, but you're only going to get real-time data for 10 seconds, or you're only going to get real-time data for a certain scope within the city. And that's something that emerged from thinking about deploying these models in an urban context that we wouldn't have thought about otherwise.
I think just tying together two comments here in terms of the edge type of notion is, to me, that is one version of adding friction to the data. And this is really an economic friction, namely, if you have data not centrally located, but have it only at the edge, in there, it's much harder to just create these, my hypothetical, divorce lawyer tracking application, simply because you would have to somehow get the data out of each of these edge locations, as opposed to finding one untrustworthy or maybe eager to sell data broker in that. So that might be one kind of example of adding friction to data retrieval and access that does not prevent the real-time interactions that you mentioned, but does make it harder and makes it easier to convince, and this is the kind of a trust one that I think you mentioned as well, is that convincing people that you're not doing anything nefarious with things you can't see. I mean, you don't see data. It's not like other things where you can have some physical notion as to what's going on. You have to, by having physical constraints, you now say, yep, that data lives on that disk. And then maybe we can unify that with your initial approach, namely to have trusted entity that certify to the behavior of that data, which we currently don't have because we trust the companies themselves, but there's no, I have to basically take them at their word. There's no third party that does what we do for like safety type of applications. We don't just generally, maybe that will change in the next year or so, but we don't maybe Boeing is a bad example. We see what happens when we let companies certify their own safety, let's put it that way. And we hopefully have had at least some external, neutral, non-conflicted body there. So maybe that is a way to also, go ahead, you look like you were trying to chime in.
So I just wanted to mention that so we've talked a lot about like issues, challenges, and things like this. I think I wanted to mention, and I think I'm kind of building upon what Andrew said. Our approach currently in CS3 is basically to say, look, there are endless applications. The scope is way too big for us to actually come up with a concrete, specific privacy architecture, for this mammoth of, smart cities, whatever they mean. Instead, what we are going to do is we're going to restrict the application domain to a bunch of applications, and we're going to grow over time. But in V1, the first version of, of our privacy architecture, of our approach, we're going to start with a few. And what we're going to do is we're going to develop a privacy architecture that we can believe will actually work a little bit, to install some trust. And I'll just tell you the gist of it, right? You're in an intersection. You want, the assisted cross, what is it called? For visually impaired,
Wayfinding.
the wayfinding one, right? So for the wayfinding application, you're there is a person who's visually impaired. You want all the cameras, right, the city infrastructure to work for you, to tell you, for example, to send to your mobile device information about, which car is coming and when you should, cross versus not cross and things like this, right? So that you can find your way safely through that. That right there, the use of the data, right, in that intersection at that moment in time, without any collection of it or transmitting it, over to a backend cloud or anything like this, I argue that that is not a privacy concern. That is not what worries us when we talk about smart cities and surveillance and so on. It is when data starts to be collected and sent back to clouds, or collected either longitudinally or tracked across many different locations, many different regions in the city, and then you're starting to talk about, this is what you care about. This is what surveillance, what we mean when we say that we're worried about surveillance, we're worried about mass stuff and so on, okay? All right, so what we're going to do is, the only thing I know how to do, define APIs. To do the wayfinding thing in context, you're going to be able to operate. I'm going to give you the raw data, but I'm going to sandbox you. You cannot send the data over, to the backend and collect it for other purposes and do whatever you want, correlate it with other intersections data and so on. You can't do that. That's API 1. How about the second API? Sure, you want to also collect, run some statistics.
Sorry to interrupt, but we're out of...
I open a separate API. Anyway, the point is, if you differentiate these pieces of functionality and couple together, and as they are done now in most mobile applications and so on, then you can do, you can actually think about privacy, and you can architect privacy into that kind of scenario. Yes.
Sorry, we're unfortunately out. So I want to give Andrew a chance to wrap up before...
Yeah, thank you very, very much. I want to... We are definitely doing more than something. So I just wanted to thank Henning, Jesse, Roxana, and Jorge again for an outstanding conversation. And we can continue it after if you're available. So thank you again, all of you. And I just wanted to make one plug for our next event, the public event. And this is our Validate Accelerator demo day. This is where we have our student faculty accelerator teams that are going to be making their pitches, and they're working on topics. There are going to be 7 different teams working on topics in smart intersections, natural disaster preparedness, and community engagement. And it'll also feature a keynote from the president of NEC Labs, Christopher White. And also there will be a panel of a VC panel on investing in early stage urban tech. And I think registration information will be on our website in the coming days, certainly I think within the week. So look out for that. That's cs3-erc.org. Yeah, so again, I just wanted to thank, if you can join me in thanking our panel again. Thank you very much.